What about Timothy? Before we jump in this letter, let's understand a little bit about Timothy. What's he all about? He was the son of a Greek father and a Jewish mother. So his mother was Jewish, his father was not. And there's no mention that his father was saved. He apparently was influenced by his mother Eunice and his grandmother Lois. They were both known for their sincere faith, and they're the ones that really tutored him. Praise God for that. And he was living at Lystra when Paul visited that city on his first journey. He lived there then, but he wasn't called to the second journey. He apparently had earned a good reputation. And Paul probably, there's no reason to believe that he was the one that led him to Christ. More than likely it was, the grandmother and mother. But he probably had ordained the young minister finally and had great confidence in him, we'll discover as we go along here. At any rate, he already knew and believed the Old Testament scriptures thanks to his mother and grandmother. And so that's why Paul could pick him up as a promising protege. And his promise for the ministry was recognized early, as we'll see reconfirmed several times in these letters. And apparently, there's also the hint that there were certain prophetic utterances that confirmed his appointment. And we should recognize that happens today. That happens today. There are some groups that overemphasize some of these gifts. There's other groups that deny these gifts, but these gifts are around. And some of them are indeed legitimate. Paul became like a spiritual father to a young man, and he refers to him as my true son in the faith, my dear son. That's a repeated phrase by Paul to express the endearment and the role that this young Timothy had. And so he became a companion, one of his most trusted fellow laborers. All through his epistles, you'll find him referred to. And he became his representative and messenger on several occasions. Again, all through his letters. And 6 of Paul's epistles include Timothy in the salutations. He not only did write a letter to someone, he included Timothy as his companion. And now, because of his mixed parentage, he has him circumcised. And many people are upset by that. Why? What is this? I thought that didn't matter. It did in terms of his ministry. This seems contrary to the decision at the Jerusalem Council that occurred just before the second missionary journey. But Titus, in contrast, was not compelled to be circumcised because he was fully Gentile. He was not Jewish. Timothy was half and half, so to speak. So Paul doesn't want his ministry clouded or curtailed by him being uncircumcised. He wanted to maximize the effectiveness of his ministry. We need to remember that. There's things you don't have to do, but you might do just to maximize your acceptability to certain groups. And so this could have been an occasion for serious offense in some Jewish circles if he had remained uncircumcised. But Paul relieves that problem. It's interesting, many people don't realize when Paul is on Mars Hill in Athens, his quotes are not from the Bible, they're from 3 Greek poets of the past. Why? Because that was something they would understand. You follow me? And anyway. So Timothy becomes so dear to Paul that in his last message he makes a touching appeal for Timothy to come join him in his final days in prison. His second letter, we're reading his first letter, but his second letter, it's probably the last thing he wrote before he died. And he knew it was a final situation, and so he pleaded for Timothy to come and bring his notebooks that he had and so forth. After being released from his first Roman imprisonment, Paul and Timothy by his side evidently visited some of the churches in Asia, including Ephesus. And after that also, he apparently may have also gone to Spain. That's the big debate about that. On this departure from Ephesus, Paul left Timothy behind to provide leadership to the congregation. So he's really matured by then, because he's leaving Timothy to minister at one of the most challenging places to minister, as we'll touch on here in a minute. And then he wrote Timothy a letter, 1 Timothy, urging him on in his ministry at Ephesus. Are we together? Okay. We gather Timothy was probably somewhat passive, timid, retiring, easily intimidated. He was very young, and he might have been very light, frail. He wasn't a strong, dominant kind of character. Paul is repeatedly spurring him on to action all through his letters. And he's rather young. Paul exhorts him, let no one despise your youth. He said that to him 15 years later. So he must have been really young when he started. We don't know how old he was. But when he says, let no one despise your youth, we may miss the point that was 15 years after he got started here. Right? And he's let nothing, including his youth, stand in the way of his performance of his duty. You see, Paul really is a military commander. He uses military terms, as we'll see here shortly. He's like a good soldier supposed to fight the good fight, we find in 1 Timothy 1. And aggressively protecting and propagating the gospel, using the full range of all his gifts. And yet you'll find that Timothy still is easily discouraged because Paul is having to re-emphasize that again and again. And so Paul even had to tell him to hang in there, finish his work there at Ephesus. He may have had physical problems, and he obviously had physical periods of discouragement. And so it appears that some of the church members were not giving proper respect to him as God's servant. So now the organization is pretty straightforward. In 1 Timothy, the first chapter is going to be about faith in the church, and it's going to be doctrinal. Second chapter will be having to do with order in the church. How do you organize? How do you do those things? We'll talk about officers of the church, deacons and elders and so forth. And also, interestingly enough, in the fourth chapter, that apostasy was on its way. And 1 Timothy 4 is an important chapter for us to understand in our day-to-day especially. And then we have the duties detailed in chapters 5 and 6. In the second and final letter of Paul's, he talks about the afflictions and the activities of the church. Afflictions, activity, and allegiance. I lifted this from one of the commentaries. And if you've been to seminary, you always have to start with the same letter. That somehow proves things are true. They always start with P or A or whatever. So we have the afflictions, the activity, and the allegiance. Anyway, we sometimes get a little facetious or cynical about alliteration, which seems to be a seminary stamp of approval somehow.